Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. The UK is officially 100 years old this week, at least in its present form. On Monday, Northern Ireland marked the centenary of its birth and the creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There was little ceremony. More of that will come this June. The question we're asking today is, how long will that union continue to exist? Brexit has put new pressures on the union, not just in Scotland, but notably in the 6 counties of Ulster. Unionists in particular are furious about the Northern Ireland Protocol, the EU-UK agreement that puts a new trade border down the Irish Sea. It's seen as undermining British sovereignty and by some as a step towards unification of North and South. With us today, we've got Allison Morris, a columnist with the Belfast Telegraph, who has formidable contacts among former Loyalists and Republican groups. Hello, Allison.
Oh, good evening. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I know you've been flat out with various deadlines of news breaking this evening. We've also got Ben Lowry, who's the deputy editor of the newsletter, a unionist leading paper, which I think I'm safe in saying that. And incidentally, it is the world's oldest English language newspaper still in publication. Hello, Ben.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to have you with us. And we also have the indomitable Billy Graham, a veteran reporter of Northern Irish politics and the expert on our upcoming political tour of Northern Ireland that starts on the 20th of June. Hello, Billy.
Yeah, good evening. Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, great panel here. I'm very glad to have you all here. This discussion is wrapped up within the fallout from Britain's departure from the European Union. So let's start with the basics, if you like. Just to start with, Allison, can you explain what the protocol was or is and why it was seen as essential to the peace process? Allison.
Well, what happened was, obviously, after the Good Friday Agreement, there was great efforts made to remove all the security watchtowers and the army checkpoints from the border that I would have grew up with. If I had been, travelling to go south, you would have been stopped at the border. You would possibly have, I remember as a child having to get out of the car on holiday and everything had to get taken out of the car with it, and soldiers searched it, and then you went on your way. That doesn't exist now. You don't even realise when you've crossed from north to south, except maybe some of the road signs change, and that's about it. But as part of keeping that border open was quite easy when we were all a member of the EU. Keeping it open now is a very different prospect. So once Britain decided to leave the EU and obviously Northern Ireland to go with it, that raised all sorts of questions about how checks, which the EU obviously exist on to preserve the integrity of their single market, could be carried out. Some people wanted to see those checks at the border and they wanted to see checkpoints returning to the border. Obviously, that would have been seen as, at least under the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, as not to be something that anyone really wanted to see a return of. But also, there was a lot of talk at the time about the possibility of dissident Republican violence should there be checkpoints placed at the border, and what would be the possibilities of that. But I do think that the main pressure came from America. So obviously, once Britain decided to leave the EU, they really needed to get a trade deal with the US. That was how they were going to make up for leaving the single market. And Irish America really stepped in and said, any changes to the border, there'll be no trade deal. At that stage, Theresa May was Prime Minister. She came up with several different ways to try and get around this, in terms of what she proposed as withdrawal agreement. They were all voted down in the Commons until Boris Johnson came up with the idea of the Northern Ireland Protocol. I think that probably, and Ben will explain this better, why unionists are angry is because right up until the point where those checks were taking place, Boris Johnson was continuing to say, oh no, there's no sea border, there'll be no checks in the border, while there were checks. So basically, all it is in very simple terms is that goods such as, meat and eggs, any kind of animal products, they need to be checked coming in to preserve the EU's single market. They're checked now at ports. They're checked at the ports in Northern Ireland, in Belfast and in Lowry. In terms of trade, that's caused some difficulties. There's much more sort of red tape and bureaucracy and all sorts of other things to be sorted out. The EU and the British government have said they'll work through those and try and deal with those, but that's not why unionists or loyalists are angry. We can, Amazon deliveries are not what has people out rioting on the streets.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the point here is, you had talked about practicalities and you talked about the checkpoints of your when you had British troops checking people as they moved back and forth across the border. But I guess within the framework, if you think about the Good Friday Agreement, I guess it's not just about practicalities, it's also about sovereignty, a shared sense of sovereignty within the European Union on the island of Ireland.
Look, and for unionists, I mean, the majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU, but we leave as a bloc, that's what happened. For unionists, this isn't about deliveries or checks on meat or fish or anything like that. Those things can, and I'm sure they will be solved in time. It is about what they see as a betrayal by the British government. There's an ideology here, and the fact is that there's so much talk of a future border poll, of what's going to happen to this island, and they now believe they're in a sort of economic United Ireland, if you like, because they're in an economic bloc with the rest of the EU. There's a difference, a point of difference being made between the UK and Northern Ireland. And for unionists, I think that's been something that's been very hard to swallow, mainly because it's something that was implemented by the British government. It's implemented by a parliament that they would seem to be loyal to. And I think that's one of the issues that has people, that we've seen violence on the streets. But there's a lot of other things tangled up in that. I'd always say be careful not to get, hung up too much on one issue, because so many agendas all come into play at a particular time last month. And I think that's why we've seen things erupt and return to violence.
Okay, you were saying there were protests and there was violence on the streets of West Belfast last month. So some people may not be aware of that, but that has happened. Let me turn. Thank you very much, Alison, for that sort of comprehensive introduction there. Let me turn to Ben. Just give me a sense of the response among the unionist community since that protocol has been introduced in January this year, Ben.
Well, because it was all very complicated, because it's to do with trade, because it's to do with law and protocols and single markets and internal markets and customs and tariffs, very few people understood it. And even those of us who'd been following it very closely, I'd been following the debate really closely, thought that the border was a disaster from a unionist point of view, but wasn't sure until this year when it came into effect. It was proven to be a disaster. Let me just rewind a little bit to explain in simpler terms what I mean. Alison talked about growing up the border that she grew up with. I grew up with another border. I grew up in a house in County Down on the coast overlooking, on a clear day, Scotland. So I never grew up in a culture or a mindset or a thinking that the island of Ireland should be, as a geographical unit, therefore a political unit. Because I looked out onto a sea where there were ships passing back and forth between Scotland, England, Wales, but at the nearest point, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. It was free trade. It was unthinkable that there'd be a barrier in that. In the same way, it's unthinkable that there would be a barrier in trade between two states that are separated by sea, from Alaska to the mainland United States. And because the emotional argument that the island had to be protected at all costs, this is the unionist perspective, the cowardly British government response to that was to buckle in the face of the threat of Irish Republican terrorists who do not want there to be a border at all and who want the island to be a single unit, at the expense of an unthinkable barrier in internal UK trade. Now, I'm not aware of any nation on earth that has such barriers between trade. It's just not what happens. It's not what happens between the provinces of France or the states or within Canada, within Australia. So now that people understand something that was complicated, when they go to order books, when they go to order particularly things like seeds, when they're finding products that they want in supermarkets are no longer available, the anger has suddenly manifested itself. In addition to that, there is the perception that the threat of Irish Republican violence paid, and that it has always paid, and that has always made Britain nervous, now doing something that was unthinkable, that Britain itself hadn't done, and that in a small section of the unionist loyalist community that wants the British link has manifested itself in violence. But it's a very small section of the community.
Ben, just to sort of pick you up on that last point, I mean, do you really think Boris actually sort of took that on board? I mean, didn't he just want a deal? And having said "over my dead body," he thought, well, let's just get it. This is what we need to strike a deal. Sod the unionists. I'm not too bothered.
Yes. So the first thing is that there is a unionist argument to which I would be sympathetic when I've written about this, that if the United Kingdom had never joined the European Union, it wouldn't. There were already customs borders on the island of Ireland. Remember, that is where the frontier is between two jurisdictions, the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom, this part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland. There were customs and other checks on the border. Because the United Kingdom went into the European Union, and that meant that there was an internal European trade market and there were no checks, I would argue that the United Kingdom has, in effect, surrendered a right to police its own frontier. I could go on and on about that, but that's the problem that arose. And when this became the Irish argument and European Union argument that this border on the island of Ireland had to be open, when this was a sustained problem over several years, Theresa May did somersaults. It would take 3 hours to explain what she did. Try to avoid any border anywhere, which effectively meant in many respects the UK wouldn't have been leaving the European Union. So what Boris Johnson did, the argument that he's a bit of a rogue, which most unionists would think, that he's a cheat and a rogue. He came to Northern Ireland and said there would never be an internal barrier when he wanted to become Prime Minister. He became Prime Minister and swiftly, within weeks, went back, in fact, within days of his pledge to the Unionist Party. I was at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester where the Prime Minister was speaking. Within days of that, he struck a deal with the Irish Premier, the effect of which is there is this barrier.
Yeah. Can you very briefly just give me a sense of the damage to unionism, to your cause? I mean, I'm just trying to, the idea that the UK is going to reverse the protocol, which is what unionist politicians have asked for, seems very, very remote.
So it's the worst damage to unionism since the entity to which you referred 100 years ago, since the creation of Northern Ireland. And it's going to take, because as I was saying, it was all quite complicated, it's going to take decades to understand what has happened. But what is not going to happen is that unionists in Northern Ireland are going to say, game over, we'll float into an all-Ireland republic and live happily ever after. I'm not saying violence, I'm just saying there might be violence. I'm saying that the average person with my mindset is not suddenly going to be reconciled to an exit from the United Kingdom.
Okay. Billy, I want to turn to you now just to get a slightly broader perspective. You've covered politics in Northern Ireland really since the civil rights marches of the late 60s. I mean, you covered all of the troubles, the peace process thereafter, and you've seen this process of power sharing in Stormont, which has sort of worked most of the time. There have been times previously, quite recently, where Stormont hasn't been working, but it's generally been a success. How do you view this current period? Is this a big shift, do you think, in Northern Irish politics? What do you think, Billy?
Well, of course, I mean, 100 years is a long sweep of history anywhere in the world, and particularly so in a place called Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland, whatever language you can use. You have to remember the history that we came from. We mentioned in our discussions earlier some rioting. That's rioting is not new to the place. 1800s, there was a lot of rioting, a lot of sectarian rioting. In fact, and of course it continued through various periods in history and during the Troubles, and people in England didn't quite understand about this rioting, and they even said it was mindless. But of course, it wasn't mindless rioting. It was executed in a certain way, in a certain manner. There is a long folk memory of history. There's a long memory of history, yeah. and all of these things. So in all of this, we have the weight of history on our shoulders because we live in a divided society. We've had kind of, Catholics, Protestants, nationalists, unionists, labels and labeling and putting people into boxes, had segregated education system. Some sports are not played by certain sections of the community. So there's all of that which has to be taken into account as to how you work out what is this shared space, because it has to be a shared space, and it will, no matter what flag is flown, people will still have to look over the hedgerows and greet each other.
I guess what you're saying is that for what's happened in the last few months is not a major upset. You know, there are tensions, and you're trying to sort of view it on the longer scheme of things, and that's, you know, don't draw any drastic conclusions just yet.
No, I mean, as Alison, I think, and Ben quite rightly pointed out, the headlines in international newspapers and English newspapers about Belfast streets being on fire, or the ghosts of the Troubles have returned, it was a little bit over the top. Now, not to underplay some of the street disturbances, but it's more complicated than that. It's a jigsaw of events happening. Brexit, yes. Sea border, yes. COVID virus, funeral of an IRA leader a year ago, attended by up to 2,000 people. Police took photographs, names. Director of Public Prosecutions decided no prosecutions. Loyalists saw this as a two-tier justice policing system, alienation amongst young people, poor education in those working class Protestant areas, up tight to the peace walls, the walls dividing communities there. So that's a whole jigsaw of things that has to be taken into consideration in this. Now, we had the Good Friday Agreement, and believe you me, it took a long time to actually sort that out. I remember days, months, years, talks about talks, waiting, standing, and we got it. Then you had the peace process, you had decommissioning, release of prisoners, you had all that. Now, at the moment, the peace process is slow work. I mean, it's a slow work of history. Now, unionists are nervous about continued talk of United Ireland. They perhaps don't want to talk about it at this stage. They eventually will talk about whatever arrangements are made for these islands and for this island.
Billy, let me pick up on that last point there and put that to Alison. This, it would seem to me from across the RSC that there is a change, not of pace, but perhaps of expectations. And that there is, certainly if you look at Scotland and its push for independence, that the focus on Northern Ireland is what might happen in Northern Ireland. And so among nationalists, do you get a sense of expectations? There is, after all, a constitutional framework for Northern Ireland to remove itself from the United Kingdom. So perhaps could you just talk about that, about the possibility of a referendum and how that could be held and what conditions would be required for that to happen?
Well, if you'd have asked me 10 or 15 years ago, we know that in the Good Friday Agreement, there is a mechanism for when it is the will of the people who live here that, you know, there will be a referendum. I would have said not in my lifetime. It won't happen as long as I'm alive. Events overtook us, and I think that Brexit was a big accelerator of that. But I would now say that we will have a referendum, if not in 5 years' time, within the next 10 years. There will be a referendum on unity. That does not mean that people will vote for unity. It just means there will be a referendum on unity. And the difference, I think, that we see now is up until now, and not all unionists, but the vast majority of unionists have took a sort of head in the sand approach to this. It's been why would we discuss that? It's not going to happen. Don't want to talk about it. Nothing to do with me. Carry on there yourselves, but we want no part of it. And the fact is that will have to change. We have a census that was carried out earlier this year. The results of that are due in January. That'll be really interesting to see what comes out there. But the paper I'm working for now, the Belfast Telegraph, did a survey. It to mark the centenary of the creation of the state. And among the questions they had asked was about people's identity. Do you feel British? Do you feel Irish? Do you feel Northern Irish? Which is a really, important difference. And while there was like a split, three-way split among the general population, when you hammered that down and took that down to 18 to 24-year-olds, it was 47% of them felt themselves to be Northern Irish. There was around 36, 37% felt themselves to be Irish, and only a very small number considered themselves British. Now, a lot of those people who consider themselves Northern Irish will be from the Unionist community, but there'll be people who just don't feel really strongly the identity either way. And so if we have a referendum, they are going to be the people, that younger generation will decide what kind of world they want to live in. And the world they want to live in doesn't have anything to do with flags and anthems and identity and passports and what their mothers and fathers and grandfathers were fighting about, 50, 60 years ago. It has to do with where they want to live. So it has to do with their lifestyle. It has to do with education, health, job prospects. What the pandemic, I think, has made the health service a massive point of context, a massive importance to people. So if we do have a referendum, and I do believe that we will, the conversation, I think, will be very different. You don't hear anyone from Sinn Féin, as the largest Republican party trying to promote unity, you don't hear any of them speaking the way they would have, spoken 20 years ago. I don't think any of them mutters, the 32-20 socialist republic ideal. That's gone. We now talk about a new Ireland, and a new Ireland is a very different place than what would have been what the IRA were fighting to achieve. That was something very different. That was all about a nation once again. That was all about identity. This is about something very different.
So you think that Brexit is a sort of an accelerator? There's this sense that there's a decision that has been posed on Northern Ireland that it didn't want. But what you're saying is it's slightly different to Scotland, where Scotland, there's this sort of different sense of anti-Westminster feeling. One might say they don't like to describe it as this, but as anti-English. But in Northern Ireland, you're saying there's been a shifting sense of identity anyway, quite apart from Brexit.
Yeah, and there are people who are strongly Irish and strongly British. And if we had a referendum tomorrow, those people would always vote one way. They would vote to leave and become part of the United Ireland, or they would vote to stay as part of the UK. And it doesn't matter. I mean, I spoke to Marvin Gibson as a senior member of the Orange Order, the loyalist organisation. And I remember he told me he'd rather sleep on the street in a cardboard box than live in United Ireland. But those people won't decide our future, because those people are on the two edges. It's the people in the middle. And I do think that's where unionists have taken their eye off the ball, because if they had have created somewhere which was prosperous and comfortable and socially forward thinking, the fact that unionist parties, and specifically the DUP, block social change, block things that are considered just a matter of normality at other places like same-sex marriage and abortion provision. And those younger people, even those younger unionists, I think that there's a mistake that they have inherited these sort of religious ideals of their parents and grandparents. They aren't. You can be unionist and socially liberal, and that is a growing demographic of young people who live here. And I think that, the problem that unionism has is they haven't made this a very comfortable place for those people. And so that'll be the deciding factor. But I'm really fascinated by the amount of, possibilities of what will it be, because Brexit taught us one thing: do not have a referendum unless you know what you're voting for. Don't let some pick some and then try and spend the next 3 years trying to work out what the hell it is you voted for. So will it be, one island with two governments? Will we retain a government at Stormont and a government at Dublin? Will it be, an island that has, will the British still have some input? Will unionists be given a quota so that they always maintain, regardless of how the demographics change, a certain number of politicians? What will it look like? And I think that, when you get down to the conversations of that, just someone who's interested in politics, the possibilities of what you could create are endless. But to people like Ben, that kind of conversation is something that I'm sure just fills them with terror, because what it is this is the trajectory that we're moving in. And you can stop it by not speaking about it, or you can stop it by trying to burn buses across the road, but that's not going to stop it anyway. The conversation will have to have been had at some time, at some stage. And I think that there's a younger generation that are willing to have that conversation. But I do think that what we have seen is most of our politicians are of a much older generation, and they seem to believe that their children and their grandchildren think the same way they do, and they don't. They just don't.
Alison, let's come on to I'd love to talk a bit more about the ideas that there could be a new Ireland. That's the expression that you used and a lot of people use, as opposed to United Ireland. In a year and a half ago, we did a trip we were in Derry, Belfast, and then Dublin. We had some very interesting opinions. So I'd love to come back to that in a second and talk to you. But Ben, Alison's got a very valid point. Unionism, the DUP, is way to the right of really any political party in the rest of the UK. The party's views on homosexuality are way off. It's against abortion. Really many things that are beyond the pale in the rest of UK politics. So unionism has a problem in Northern Ireland.
Yes, this is a big problem, and the problem essentially is this: unionism is, by its very nature, conservative, small c conservative. It wants to conserve the status quo. Therefore, it has always tended to have conservative positions. Again, there's a very long conversation to be had on this, which I won't go into, to say that it was the United Kingdom link that meant in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, Northern Ireland moved on a lot of social questions in a way that the Catholic-dominated Republic of Ireland did not. The Republic of Ireland being in 1993 pretty much the last country in Western Europe to decriminalize homosexuality. So many of us who are unionists are not happy to see us losing this battle, but we are losing the battle, and the fact that unionists using that battle on social conservatism, the fact that unionism is seen as an old people thing is not good with regard to the loss of potential younger voters. So that is a risk. There's no question that Brexit has reopened a question about the future of Northern Ireland that was settled. But there were a couple of things that Alison said that I do want to challenge. She said unionists are sticking their heads in the sand and are terrified. Well, some unionists are terrified and some unionists are sticking their head in the sand. But I think we need to separate out complacency on the part of unionism, which is wrong, and thinking everything's fine and we can just continue as is and all will be well. That all might be well, but that's the wrong attitude. Separate not having that attitude with the idea that unionists should engage in talk about a new Ireland. No, unionists should not engage in talk about a new Ireland. It legitimizes the sense that we should be ejected from the United Kingdom. The Republic of Ireland, the southern half of Ireland, left the United Kingdom 100 years ago. It went out on its own. It was pretty difficult for the first 50 years. It sat out the Second World War, et cetera, et cetera. It was very impoverished. It was very, very ultra-conservative. It's now become a much more dynamic and modern state. But we don't want to leave the United Kingdom, which is 10 times bigger, which is the world's 5th largest economy, which is plugged in, a very close ally with the United States and the Five Eyes and so on. We don't want to leave that to join a much smaller entity. So we shouldn't legitimize that talk while not being complacent.
Ben, I want to come back to you, and this is a sort of broader question. I think unionism is in crisis across the United Kingdom. I mean, you might be faced with a situation where Scotland has become independent. And where does that leave you then?
It's a really, really important question. So the Scottish referendum on independence was in 2014. I was in Edinburgh that day. And it went from being in 2012, approaching 70%, 65, 70% support for Scotland staying in the UK, to at one point leaving the UK was ahead in the polls. It ended up fairly narrowly voting to stay in the UK. So that moved very quickly. Brexit was expected UK to stay in the European Union. That moved very quickly. And the vote was famously lost for those who wanted to stay in Europe. And of course, in the United States, Donald Trump, they were saying well into 2016 that he wouldn't even win the Republican nomination, let alone the presidency. So it's back to my point about complacency. We have to be careful about that. I do think in unionism's favor is that the stakes being higher here, there probably is less likely to be dramatic movement, worries about violence, long-standing ancestral feelings of which side of the divide that you're on. It's probably less likely than Scotland, less likely than the United States electing an unexpected president, less likely than the UK voting to leave the European Union, that Northern Ireland would lurch in that way. But, sorry, Nicholas, to come back to the really key part of what you're asking about, if Scotland was to go, and it is still on, there's an election tomorrow or the day after, if Scotland was to go, then we have a real problem, unionists in Northern Ireland, because we're talking about a United Kingdom of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Draw that out on a map, remove Scotland from a map, And the point of the UK that I used to see from my bedroom window growing up is a different country. And I think that we have to be honest as unionists. If Scotland goes, we're in pretty serious trouble.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting point there. Billy, let's turn to you now. I remember our trip to Dublin. We had several meetings, and one of the things that really stuck out when we were there was somebody saying that if there was a new Ireland or a united Ireland, he thought it would be a more British Ireland. In other words, it would have to embrace unionists in the north who have a British identity. Do you remember that conversation?
Yes, I do indeed. And it's a very complex kind of question and comment, obviously, in any new arrangements, if there was a vote to join the Republic. You would obviously have to have a new constitution, a new flag. You don't really know what the political arrangements would be. You might think of devolved or certain administrations in Ulster, Munster, Connaught and Leinster, and you would probably try and prize some of the power out of Dublin and Dublin City, because the centralisation of power in Dublin has left some areas in Leinster or Munster not that well served by centering all power in Dublin. So very, very interesting. All the arrangements that you would think about. Of course, how do Southern Irelanders feel about a new Ireland or a united Ireland, and what would their vote be? Probably, as opinion polls would suggest, they may vote probably for a united Ireland, but there's a kind of a mixed feeling. The north is.
There'd have to be a vote north and south, Billy, wasn't it? And that it's generally agreed that there'd be the north would hold a referendum and the Republic would hold a referendum because it affects them as much as the north.
Yeah, and of course, I'm not saying we're like that. We want to be like north of Italy and south of Italy, and that kind of attitude that they have there towards each other. But certainly within a certain in Dublin, there would be no great enthusiasm to bring the troublesome north. They think we're sometimes a little bit of. Yeah. I think we're sometimes a little bit of trouble. Yeah. But generally, and interesting enough, quite a few Southern Irish people who have made their home in Northern Ireland and work in the north are actually opposed to a united Ireland, which is quite strange. But nevertheless, and of course they throw at me all kinds of questions about a health service, pensions. The groundwork, the analysis really hasn't been done. The economic analysis hasn't been done. There are claims and counterclaims about the standard of living. Is it better in the south or is it better in the north? Different economists. Of course, some of those economists have either a unionist background or a nationalist background. So
So there are many questions that go into, and as Alison was saying, if you're going to have a referendum, as we've learned from Brexit, you should be pretty precise about what you're proposing to people. I'd love to get questions now from people. We've had a really good overview, I think, in the last half hour from our panelists. So please start putting your questions in the Q&A box. I know I got sent an email about education in Northern Ireland. That I know that's a sort of an ongoing and an interesting question. But whilst people are starting to put those questions down, I do want to plug into Alison's knowledge of dissident groups. The fear is generally that if you push around too much with the peace process, you're going to get a violent reaction. What's your assessment of that question generally? What's been happening? What are the noises you've been hearing the last few months?
So the dissident Republican groups, their strength sort of rises and falls depending on what's happened at that particular time. There was a time maybe 7 or 8 years ago where they posed a real threat to peace and they generally mobilized themselves. They had recruited people who could make bombs, who were former members of the professional IRA. And we could see they were using weaponry that hadn't existed before, so they've got a hold of guns from somewhere. But then we have seen that they're incredibly infiltrated, and MI5 have been operating flat out in Northern Ireland. We had a big, massive, load of arrests last August, which took out the alleged leadership of the new IRA, which would have been the largest dissident group. But what my worry, I suppose, would be in relation to dissidents right now, I would say they pose a threat in that to individuals where they could, quite easily kill a police officer or, murder a prison guard. They don't have the capacity, they're not the capacity to drive massive bombs to England or do anything like that. That is not within their capability. But what they have been doing, and specifically this relates to Derry City, is that they have been recruiting very young people into their ranks. And when there's disturbances in Derry, there are very young men involved. And the murder of Lowry McKee, the main suspect in that murder, was 19 years of age. This is someone who was born into peace, who you would never have imagined would ever have had a gun in their hands. And that was the age group and the demographic of the people. I know before lockdown and before all those sort of social events ended, some people living in the city said they were getting really concerned that when the Sura, which is the sort of political wing of the new IRA, were holding social events, that there were crowds and droves of very young men and women attending those events. It was really concerning them that it was becoming normalised and legitimised. So I would say right now, in terms of a threat to the border, it's minimal. In terms of a threat to national security, it's very low right now. But that's not to say that couldn't increase, because the leadership of that organisation, if they're in prison, well, people who replace them are people who are very young, have no memory of our troubles or conflicts, who don't know the hardship that comes along with that. And they tend to be slightly more radical, especially because you're talking about young men who come from an area. The Derry is not like Belfast. It hasn't seen as much investment, as much peace dividend. It has very high unemployment among those young men. People who, come from socially and economically deprived areas are ripe for the picking and ripe for recruiting for paramilitary groups. That's the demographic that they target, because they know that those young men are very susceptible to that, and so all of that would concern me, that our island and this place we live in, violence comes in cycles. So I wouldn't be so naive as to say we couldn't see a return to that kind of violence in the future. But right now, they are so under the boot of the intelligence agencies that they can barely move without getting arrested. So that has sort of clamped down on any recent activity. We have seen some incidents around the border, some fairly minor and sporadic incidents, but the numbers that exist there would be quite low. Whereas we're talking, some loyalist paramilitary groups continue to recruit after the ceasefire. And, individual areas like the East Belfast UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force in East Belfast they argue they've got like 1,200, 1,400 members. In distant Republican groups, you're talking 150, 250 people. Maybe in Derry, maybe 450 people. They're not massive numbers. They really aren't.
Yeah. When we were in Derry, I was struck by how young some of the people involved were, and I did find that shocking. But on the sort of the loyalist side, it seemed to be quite experienced hands who were involved in that. Again, if you want to delve into all of this, do join us on our tour on the 20th of June, where we will be in Derry and in Belfast. And I hopefully, if they've got time, meeting some of the speakers here, if possible. Let's bring in some questions now. So Simon Jackson's up first, followed by Hilary Matthews. Simon, just say where you are and go ahead with your question.
I'm in London. Two questions. Firstly, with the benefit of hindsight, would the unionists have done better, or at least be less unhappy, had they worked with Theresa May rather than helping to bring her down? And the second question, given that the European Union had no intention of allowing a situation where there was a border neither between the Republic and Ulster or in the Irish Sea, and given that the UK had no power to compel them to accept such an arrangement, what was it that the Unionists actually wanted that might have been achievable?
And do you want to answer the question? One should say that a majority in Stormont, in the Northern Irish Assembly, can actually vote down the protocol. That's right, isn't it, Ben?
That's the advantage over Theresa May's deal. in a sense, I'm maybe not the best person to answer this, because I wrote an article I write a very unionist column every week, pretty hard hitting, and I did write a column before Brexit saying, on the Saturday before, saying this could blow the UK apart. So I was somebody who's quite Eurosceptic, who the more I thought about it, I interviewed everybody who came here, Boris Johnson, you name it, and I just, the more I thought about it, I thought this is really, really problematic. So I don't have the usual take on it. The first thing I thought the obvious thing was to have a Norway. I think there were a number of profound problems with Theresa May's deal. The first major problem you've touched on there, Nicholas, which was there was no exit mechanism. Unlike Boris Johnson's disastrous deal, at least has some sort of theoretical exit mechanism. I think that Theresa May's deal did another thing. So, for example, when it came to the customs union, Northern Ireland would have been in the customs union, and the rest of the UK would have been in a customs union. I remember Vernon Bognador, the constitutional expert, wrote an article that made me realize there was no customs solution to the UK's then problem of what the hell to do when there was the paralysis after the Brexit vote. And he said that it was the worst of all worlds. And even if he's wrong about that, if there was a perception in Middle England that the customs, aside from the single market aspects of Theresa May's deal, were intolerable, then what would have happened under Theresa May's deal is that in 5 or 10 years, England would have broken away, Great Britain would have broken away, and Northern Ireland would have been trapped. So we would have had a disastrous border in any event. So my answer to your question is yes, in the sense that it would have made sense for unionists perhaps to ally themselves with the more moderate pro-European wing of the Conservative Party. Perhaps no as to whether or not Theresa May's deal was actually ultimately going to lead to anything other than a border in the Irish Sea also.
Yeah, so it's essentially there's an inherent contradiction between Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement. You can't have one without with the other.
Well, that's in dispute. I mean, there's nothing in the Belfast Agreement that says that that we have to be in the European Union. I do accept that the Belfast Agreement in 1998, in the middle almost of the UK's time in the European Union, that nobody was even thinking about being outside of the EU. So it did breach the spirit of it, you could say. But yeah, I think that it was a dangerous project. I do understand why unionists allied themselves to Brexiteers, having said all that. That people who are emotionally very British were aligning themselves with people who they thought were emotionally very British. And I think they are Brexiteers. They ended up being, when it came to the crunch, more English British than British British.
Yeah, absolute sovereignty. I want to bring in Marty Ryan first, because I think this sort of plugs into this this conversation first, and then Hilary Matthews. Go ahead, Marty. Just say where you are as well, Marty.
Oh, I'm in the US. And I've had a long-term interest in Ireland, Northern Ireland in particular. So I've been reading about the quote resignation of the Northern Ireland's Prime Minister, if that's the correct title. And so my question is what is really behind that? And then secondly is, what's going to be the impact, do you think, of whoever replaces her? And I think there's one candidate who's pretty frightening. So I'm going
to chuck this to Alison. I know Ben is the official unionist here. Personally, give you a throw to Alison.
I'm an all-rounder.
Go on, Alison. Why did Arlene Foster, who's the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, was the first minister? And she was effectively forced to resign by her party. Why was she forced to do so? What did she disagree with her party over, Alison?
There was moves being made against Arlene Foster for some months. It's just the people who wanted to make the moves against her weren't able to convince enough people to sign a letter of no confidence in her until her sudden departure last week. Look, there's a number of things there. I mean, I'm going to go down the route of that there's a good dose and sprinkling of misogyny thrown in here, because basically what happened was the Westminster MPs were the people who were closest to Boris Johnson. They were the people who helped manoeuvre Theresa May out of her job and get Boris Johnson into the top job in Downing Street, thinking that he would be loyal to them because they were off having lunch and drinking champagne and all with the Tory party spads while they were running around in Westminster. The protocol is, for unionism is the worst possible scenario that could possibly happen. Arlene Foster is being seen as having taken her eye off the ball, having allowed Boris Johnson to sort of pull the wool over her eyes. She's getting the blame of the protocol. I would argue that there are a handful of men in Westminster who would deserve to take the blame for the protocol before her. And then there's the party's sort of fallen electoral success. Opinion polls, they have in real terms been losing votes, mainly, in a sort of moderate direction. I would argue those weren't particularly DUP votes to start with. They were the Ulster Unionist Party votes, which went to the DUP and are now leaving the DUP and heading straight for the middle of the road Alliance Party, which goes back to what I was talking about earlier, those people who consider themselves Northern Irish, those voters who don't feel particularly strong in identity, but do feel they are pro-union and they do want to see the preservation of the union, albeit, they want to see a different kind of society. And then I just think that because there are some people who never wanted her to be the First Minister, never wanted to be the leader of the party. And then I think that just, the party itself was very fractured. It was fractured almost into two parts, and there were things she wasn't the person that was able to unite them at this time. But I mean, I know that Marty says it was one of the people who seems terribly frightening. I assume you mean Edwin Poots, who was the first person to put his name forward to replace Arlene Foster. And to go back to my original point, which I know, Ben will probably disagree with me on, the day Arlene Foster became First Minister and everybody stood up one by one to congratulate her, Edwin Poots said, and I'm sure she knows her most important role will always be that of a wife and mother. And that is the kind of people that you're dealing with. This is, senior female politician in Northern Ireland. And on the big day of her life, it was history making, first female First Minister. And that was Edwin Poots' contribution to that debate that day.
Hilary, I will come to your question in just a second, but I do want to follow this up because I think it is worth hammering home. This is from the Times from last week. This is James Forsyth's column, Ben. Arlene Foster's leadership of the Democratic Unionist Party was doomed by her ambivalence on gay conversion therapy. The practice of trying to change gay people's sexuality by a prayer is popular among some evangelical Christians. The Northern Ireland First Minister's abstention on the vote to ban the practice went down badly with the DUP. Nor were they happy that one of the ministers attended a meeting with her counterpart in the Irish Republic. These are things that you wouldn't want to associate yourself with, yet this is where the party's going.
So the dooming of Arlene Foster, at least 5 or 6 issues. The first issue is there was a major scandal, energy scandal, which raised serious questions about her ability to cope with detail and her ability to be a good leader. Brexit, as I said, threw the cards in the air and has caused immense problems for unionism. There are very bitter divisions here over cultural matters like an Irish Language Act. So unionism was being pulled apart anyway. Then there's the fact that she's actually a very abrupt woman. She's very abrupt in broadcasts if you've seen her, but she was abrupt with colleagues. I mean, we heard this again and again and again as journalists. And, she did lose 85% of her MLAs. These are the people at Stormont, her politicians, who signed this letter against her last week. That's pretty bad. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, when she got into difficulties at the end, still won more than half of her own parliamentarians. So that was the other issue. There is, of course, a degree of traditionalist in the DUP who wouldn't like a female leader. But the gay conversion therapy, right, okay, yes, she was one of 5 people to abstain on a ban on gay conversion therapy. 23 of our MLAs, all of the rest, voted for the ban. But remember what this is for a socially conservative party. We've moved from the DUP strongly opposing homosexuality being decriminalized in 1980, which is when it was, 1982, to now all it does is say, well, hold on a minute. If somebody wants to go to see a pastor or whatever and talk about their sexuality and pray and try to become heterosexual, we shouldn't actually ban that. So it wasn't a really, from their perspective, it's pretty mild conservatism.
Progress.
It's 2021 and these people were voting on basically a practice that amounts to, the mild torture of gay people. I mean, it's just, if this is where I think that the DUP ran into problems when they went over to align themselves with a Conservative Party. They assume that people who are conservative in their politics are conservative socially, which many members of the Tory Party would not be. Let's face it, some of them lead pretty colourful lives themselves and would not be that socially conservative. And that's how, when when they go to Westminster and when they go to London, that some of them think that they're just like from another world. They can't understand that people would still believe in these things, or still practice them. I think, you know, that I understand that people's religion is very important to them. I just don't believe that in the modern world it has any place in politics. You know, you do that, go and pray in your own private town.
Very quickly, Marty, I hardly need tell you, as somebody who's interested in Northern Ireland and aware of it, that we have significantly higher church-going rates than England. England is one of the most non-church-going countries, one of the highest rates of atheism in Europe. Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, actually something we have in common is that it's, you know, it's now under 50%. It's declining here very fast, but it's still much more of a church-going society than England. So there's a much bigger conservative and evangelical wing here. But yes, there's no question it's in decline.
Okay, Hilary Matthews, let's take your question, and I think we'll put it to Billy. So go ahead, Hilary.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm going back. I can't keep 10 ideas in my head like the journalists can, but I want to go back to, try if I can remember now, to what you said about the young people. Channel 4 Channel 4 News has had a series where Porrick O'Brien has been interviewing young people on both sides of the wall in Belfast, and I found it very dispiriting, because what I heard was they were repeating what they'd heard from their parents and their grandparents, and that nothing was changing. And Alison, you talked too about how the young were ripe for the picking from the paramilitary groups and so on. So my question is, what hope is there? I found it very dispiriting. The young are perpetuating these generational beliefs and values, and you know, I would love there to be some hope for the future.
Yeah.
From what you're
Billy,
saying, I don't see it.
Yeah, Billy, I've got to follow up on that. It does seem to me as well, it's almost as though your sort of partisan national identity, it's almost like belonging to a football team. You know, you support Man U or City. And instead of that, you're either a nationalist or a loyalist. And you know, that it seems to me as sort of natural as supporting a football team, and it doesn't seem to me as though things changed that drastically. Is that a fair comment to make, Billy?
Yeah, well, just going to the questioner, yeah, it's things. I mean, we don't give up hope on this at all in any of these areas, but there have been areas left behind. There have been some people, young people left behind in the peace process, underachievement in education. So really, it's about trying to fix those things, improve those things. I mean, for example, some community funding has been cut in certain areas, in certain deprived areas, and this is a bad thing. So it's the politicians, both unionist and nationalist, have to make lives better for things better for these young people in these areas. Give them hope, give them jobs, give them employment, and then you can try and take step by step in this peace process. I mean, and also really we should know that there are many community groups, including in these interface areas, working really hard to ensure that the peace continues. And they have mobile phones. Former IRA men, former UDA men have mobile phones that they talk to each other all the time on. And some of those people are trying to calm things. And a lot of community organizations across Northern Ireland are doing quite considerable work, but this kind of work is not reported on in the press or on television or in talking shows.
It's significant that they still have a lot of hold. So if you're a former paramilitary, you have a significant influence in your neighborhood, and we might not like that, but that's the reality. That's the legacy of the conflict, and they're still there, exercising that influence. I mean, we've met them. We know that that they can marshal youths onto the street if they want to, and they can pull them off the street if they want to.
The problem that I'd seen with the recent man is they couldn't actually pull them off the street if they wanted to. So what happened was those young people who, and I would say there's massive amounts of hope here. It's a lovely place, like it really is. And it's come on so much since, you know, I was growing up, and I come from a very working class area, you know, and I'm like one of 8 children, and my mother was a cleaner. You know, we didn't have any great means, but there was a lot of positivity in terms of trying to push you towards education and push you towards better things. And that still exists. But you do have a core of young people who, remember, we have generational trauma here. So a lot of times their parents might have addiction problems or alcohol problems, that translates down. There's generational trauma being passed down from one to another, with very high rates of mental illness and suicide among young people here, and all of that exists in any post-conflict society. And you know, if one child's left behind, it's one child too many. But I mean, in the rioting that took place in West Belfast, I mean, the name won't mean anything to yourselves, but Sean Spike Murray, who was one of the most senior members of the IRA in West Belfast, was on that interface trying to calm it down. At one stage, one of the young men threw a petrol bomb at his feet, which would have been, you know, unthinkable, because this is the man who sorted things out. And the fact that they had such a, you know, they didn't even know who he was, I don't think, at this point in time. And they were just there for a riot, as in what we call an awful name, recreational riot. And there were young people who, if you stopped them, they couldn't have told you while they were there why they were rioting. They couldn't give you a reason. It's just they had nothing to do, and this seemed like something to do.
Something to do.
Yeah. And you have to remember that the majority of them are young men, and the majority of them are young men who have fallen out of education. We had a lockdown, so they weren't in any kind of training or any kind of education for over a year. And I think that all made an imperfect storm that all fed into it.
In terms of social deprivation, if I was to go to areas outside Liverpool or Glasgow, it would be no different, really, would it?
No, and that's why, I mean, you know, that you have gang culture in some places, and you also, you know, have high levels of crime. And that just, it's no accident that the areas that have high levels of social and economic deprivation are the places that still have high levels of paramilitary activity. I mean, that did not happen by accident. It's, you know, a fact of life. And if there had been more effort went into fixing that problem, you would have fixed the paramilitary problem, because a young person who has hope and has, you know, a good job and, you know, is going on holiday once a year with their mates, they have no interest in getting involved in paramilitarism or criminality. But the fact is that the amount of money, and this might also interest you, Marty, that was sent, a lot of it from America, a lot of peace money that was plumbed into areas, in some cases just didn't go where it was intended to go. It went to paramilitary linked groups. It was almost like buying their peace. These were projects that were meant to be to tackle educational underachievement, to attract investment in the areas, and it wasn't. It was just squandered away. You know, I would love to know how many times, you know, there's groups of, you know, older paramilitary men, and if you go back 20 years, they've been on more trips to the Somme and trips to Auschwitz and trips to, you know, Washington and trips to everywhere else, all paid for. And this was meant to be building our peace, when in reality, they should have went right down to the ground. It should have been the women's groups and peace groups and those groups that got that money.
Yeah, there's a sense of an elite, a former military elite on both sides who've done very well, who've become sort of public speakers, who fly around the world, who enjoy this recognition. But you're saying that hasn't reached down to the grassroots.
In some areas it has, and I go into areas where those transitional groups have done amazing work, but that's not universal across the board. In some areas, that money went straight into the pockets of gangsters, and it never trickled down. And, you know, and I always thinking as a woman in a working class community I came from, the women were the strongest, and the women were the people who could change anything. Because if you change a mother's life, you change your children's life. I mean, I was, you know, lived in extreme poverty, and I was able, you know, to become a journalist, and therefore my children all went to university. They all lived different lives than me. You just have to change one person's life, and you change everyone's life after that. But that just didn't trickle down. And then you have to add in the whole post-conflict trauma and everything that comes with it that existed in those areas. And places like, you know, North and West Belfast and like Derry, there would have been high levels of sort of murders and bombings during the Troubles, but that also meant that people were living with high levels of prescription medication, you know, addiction and all sorts of other things just to get them through the day. And I see it all the time, that generational trauma that's being trickled down, because we have no legacy process to deal with our legacy. So people are handing, you know, their fights for justice to their children and their grandchildren. So, you know, the past becomes their future, and they're left to sort of fight these sort of futile battles that are never going to go anywhere. But it means that they're, you know, continually re-traumatized from something that they shouldn't have had to think about at all.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap it up now. I know Nigel Harley's got a question, but we'll save that question for just after the break. I don't know if Ben or Alison, you can stay on just for a couple of minutes afterwards, and then we'll let you go. But I just want to wrap things up now before the break. we have our own sort of conversation after the hour. But can I pick on you? I'm going to pick on you and give you 1 minute each to say how you think things are going to go in the next year, the next year or so. Just give us a projection of how you think things are going to go. So I'm going to take you, each person, 1 minute each, starting with you, Ben.
I think there are profound problems here. There, as I was saying about unionism not being able to reconcile a lot of the directions in which it is being pulled, and its ability to deliver on an Irish Language Act, which was in a deal last year, which is essential to Irish Republicans. The unionist grassroots won't accept it. Brexit, the protocol, whether or not unionists operate, I think that it's really going to be a struggle for Stormont to survive next year and not fall. And if it does fall, goodness knows what will happen.
Alison, how do you see the next year?
I'm usually a very positive person. I'm a glass half full of wine at all times person. But no, I'm not optimistic that we're heading towards a very good time. The fact that we haven't had any violence on the streets in the past couple of weeks has been due to the hard work of other people, but we're heading into the marching season. We have loyalists who say they're not going to engage with the police in terms of organising parades and all sorts of other things. We could see more violence in the summer months. And then there's the political crisis at Stormont, and who replaces Arlene Foster, and will that person want to work power sharing and will want to make it work, or are we heading towards another collapse? And for unionism, I think that's the worst possible scenario, because then we go to direct rule under Boris Johnson, who has already shown himself to be not the most truthful when it came to dealing with the aspects and problems faced by unionists.
Billy, 1 minute on the next year. Billy.
Yeah, okay. I think London and Brussels will move to iron out some of the creases in the protocol and have a very light touch on the protocol. I think that the DUP is going through its own difficulties, but I suspect, I don't know, I think a former leader, Peter Robinson, is managing things in the background. Peter is a politician to his fingertips, as Martin McGuinness once said. And I think there will be discussions, there will be talks. Do not be too gloomy, please. We'll see our way through this.
My thanks to Billy Graham, ever the optimist there, to Allison Morris, and also to Ben Lowry. It's been a fantastic hour. My thanks to all of you for a really good overview there.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.